Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 9 in our international political economy journey. We are now in our final week and final topic of our second section of the course, where we've tracked pretty much through most of the 20th and the early 21st century and dealing with a lot of political economy evolutions, developments, and also crises. Now, we're going to have a break next week, a much long sought after break, and I applaud you all for sticking through these first 9 weeks to get there. And then after the mid-semester break, we will then have the final part of our course, which deals with the future of the political economy and some contemporary issues as well. But this week, we're touching on a crisis that has personally affected all of us in some capacity, and that is COVID. So we're going to be analyzing the COVID-19 pandemic, and especially, and most importantly, the political economy drivers of the pandemic. So that's going to be the major focus of this lecture. And we'll talk more about these in tutorials, as well as discuss some of the policy responses to the pandemic that leaders worldwide has also addressed. So before we get to that, I'll firstly just note if I can move our slides, our learning objectives for today or this week, as well as the tutorials and the readings too. And I'd also recommend another one of Tuz's books that I've got for us this week, Shut Down. For those of you who hopefully read Tuz's book on the global financial crisis, you'll know that he's a very good author that tracks the developments of these major political economy crises. So I'd recommend reading that book. Well, more than recommend, really, because it's a required reading, so it's very important for you regardless. And as well for anyone who quite likes Adam Tooze's writing, I mentioned this to a couple of my tutorial students. Adam Tooze is a very prominent political economist and he also does a blog which is really worthwhile. If you follow him on Twitter, for example, or just search him on Google, you'll find a link to sign up to his blog/newsletter. And he does a great job of going through, like every week, different political economy issues and doing a very short, nice analysis of them. So you'll probably find, no doubt, that he has addressed your research question in some capacity for your assignment. So it might be worth looking into. We also have the Spark and Williams journal article on the impact of neoliberalism and COVID together. So both of these are very good readings, and I look forward to discussing them in our tutorials coming up as well. Now, before we go into the political economy stuff, it'd be remiss of me not to talk a little bit on the bioepidemiology. My medical background still impels me to do so. So we were going to start at this location, which will most likely be quite an obvious overview for most people, but I just want to make sure we go into it anyway, just to make sure that we're on the same page. So the COVID-19 disease is a coronavirus disease, and and the actual condition itself was caused by, and is still caused by, an acute respiratory syndrome. And that acute respiratory syndrome is called coronavirus 2 SARS, so SARS CoV-2 for short. Coronaviruses belong to the family Coronaviridae, which produce generally mild to severe respiratory disease in humans. Coronaviruses are also found in various animals, such as bats, birds, cattle, cats, and pigs as well. And in recent decades, there's been 3 major coronavirus outbreaks worldwide. In 2002 and 2012, 2 highly pathogenic coronaviruses with a zoonotic origin, severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus SARS, and the Middle East respiratory syndrome coronavirus MERS, respectively, caused fatal respiratory illness and made these coronaviruses a new public health concern in the 21st century. So they're quite a relatively new development in the field of viruses. And data shows that the main mode of transmission of SARS COVID-2, which is the COVID epidemic that we have recently dealt with, is human-to-human transmission. It was thought to occur mainly through close contact, either in the form of respiratory droplets or aerosols. And these droplets can be broadly described as macro entities that then gravitate towards the ground approximately within 3 to 6 feet of the source person. Most symptomatic COVID-19 patients have a chance to infect other humans who come into close contact, but most of the asymptomatic patients can also serve as carriers of COVID-19 and can unknowingly transmit infection, which is why we saw such a huge and quick spread throughout the most active phases of the pandemic. And this also kind of helps to explain too the laxity in the practice of isolation for those who didn't have symptomology, but were still able to obviously spread the infection as well. Now, the common symptom in most COVID-19 patients is hypoxia, which is a low oxygen in the body tissues. And if worsened, this can lead to acute respiratory distress syndrome, which is where the disease itself gets its name from. An unusual phenomenon also seen in COVID patients is what's called silent hypoxemia, which is low oxygen in blood. And this we did see more and more, where patients with silent hypoxemia experience no or mild respiratory discomfort and dyspnea, which is like irregular breathing, despite critically low amounts of oxygen in their blood. I don't know if you've seen this, but I've just got a Norton subscription pop up on my screen. So I just got that away. Hopefully that didn't disturb your enjoyment of the PowerPoint. But as I was saying, one of the I guess maybe we'll just move on to once someone gets infected with COVID-19 and they have acute respiratory distress disorder, they typically show features of what we call diffuse alveolar damage, or DAD for short. And the alveoli are the smallest parts of your lung tissue, and COVID-19 can destroy them, which is problematic because most of the oxygen, well, all of the oxygen exchange occurs at the alveoli, between the alveoli and the surrounding capillaries. And outside of the pulmonary damage, there's also recognized hematological, cardiovascular, renal, neurological, dermatological, reproductive, and also psychiatric manifestations of the disease. And we don't really understand it fully yet. But as many of us know, COVID-19 has been a major and leading cause of death across the world. And for example, in the United States in 2020, it was the third leading cause of death after heart disease and cancer, with approximately 375,000 deaths. And individuals of all age are at risk of contracting this infection and still are. Patients, though, aged over 60 years old, and especially those with underlying medical comorbidities, and especially those with like obesity, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, chronic kidney, chronic lung disease, as well as smokers, those who have cancer, and also those who are transplant patients, all have an increased risk of developing severe COVID-19 infection. But across the pandemic, despite the various intersections of someone's demographics impacting the severity of the disease, and we'll talk about this more a little bit later, age did remain the strongest predictor of poor outcomes and severe illness in patients with COVID-19. Now, the percentage of COVID-19 patients, so like once you get the disease, that require hospitalization was 6 times higher across the active so-called active years of the pandemic from 2020 to 2022. The percentage of them requiring hospitalization was 6 times higher with those with pre-existing medical conditions than those without medical conditions. And just excuse me for a moment. I don't have COVID. I just have a little sniffle. So apologies. That might happen again in this lecture. But I'll try my best not to. And then If we also look at gender-based differences, there were some that emerged as well in that period, where there was some suggestions that male patients had a higher risk of severe illness and increased mortality due to COVID-19 compared to female patients. Just at the bioepidemiological level, there's obviously a lot of different gender interactions, which we'll go into soon. Now, racial and ethnic minority groups were also reported to have a higher percentage of COVID-19 related hospitalizations than Caucasian patients. And a very large meta-analysis of 50 studies from both USA and the UK noted that people of Black, Hispanic, and Asian ethnic minority groups were at increased risk of not only contracting but dying from COVID-19 infections. So there is an element there which the experience of COVID-19 has an intersectional element, and we're going to go into that more later in terms of the critical political economy behind that. Now, according to the national health bodies during those particular 2 years, from 2020 to 2022, there was two major processes that were identified as driving the pathogenesis, or the pathological development of COVID-19. And this included the replication of the virus in the early phase of the illness, and then a dysregulated immune or inflammatory response to the disease that led to systemic tissue damage in the later phases of the disease as it developed. So we kind of saw the human body kind of being unsure how to deal with this. Coronaviruses of this particular type were relatively unusual for most of our immune systems, and so it reacted in a unexpected way and also created some tissue damage. And so there were guidelines that were eventually put out where it was important to try to halt this viral replication in the early stages, especially those who are elderly or had comorbidities. So antiviral medications, for example, were important for those particular patients especially. Now, the prognosis of COVID-19, so the likelihood of how how bad the disease would progress, depended on lots of factors, as we've already mentioned, like age, the severity of illness at presentation. So if people were delayed at getting to healthcare facilities, of course, pre-existing conditions, as we noted, and how quickly treatment can be implemented, and the response to treatment. But even though, across those 2 years, the global case fatality rate was 2.2%, which sounds quite low, but when we keep in mind the vast number of people who did get COVID, the fatality rates are reasonably substantial. We'd probably say conservatively. Now, another really interesting study from a European multi-center prospective cohort study, which basically is a study where they got lots of different hospitals and health clinics together, and they had cohorts of patients, and they looked how people handled COVID over a period of time. They had 4,000 critically ill patients with COVID-19, and after 90 days, 31% of those died. So if you had, a really bad COVID from the start, there's a much higher chance that you might die. And in this study as well, they particularly noted there was high mortality with, again, our older patients, those with diseases, and especially obesity, and then the severe respiratory distress response upon contracting COVID-19. So these are just a very brief, bioepidemiological review of what COVID-19 was. I'm sure many of us don't really need a reminder there, but I also just wanted to throw in maybe some interesting epidemiological facts. And also, this biological information will be useful to us when we think about the political economy of the spread and why it impacted certain people in the manner in which it did, because often the empirical scientists from the natural sciences background will not see what we'll be able to investigate with our political economy lenses. Now, let's talk briefly about the history of the spread, just to set us up a little bit before we talk about the causes or the antecedent factors of COVID-19. Now, as we again all probably are very well aware, at the end of 2019, right at the end of 2019, a novel coronavirus emerged in Wuhan, which had become known as COVID-19. So it emerged in Wuhan in China and caused an outbreak of what was quite an atypical, unusual viral pneumonia. The virus began, it spread arguably in the seafood wholesale market in the Wuhan, Hubei province of China. And it was proposed at that particular time and as well later on that an infected animal, an intermediate host of the virus, was sold in this wet market, which then caused the spread of the virus in the marketplace, or that there was another animal intermediary from the zoonotic host, such as a bat transmitting the virus to a domesticated animal, which then passed to a human in the Wuhan market. However, as many of us are also probably well aware that even by 2024, the evidence and debate surrounding the exact origin of COVID-19 still rages. But there certainly are still, a lot of growing evidence that bats in particular are the natural hosts of this particular coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-2, as it's known, which then might have potentially infected humans through maybe an intermediate host such as pangolins or civet cats. So owing to the particular high transmission rate of the SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19, it spread quickly to the entire globe. And then on January the 7th, 2020, the Chinese Center for Disease Control and Prevention isolated a coronavirus strain from a swab of a hospitalized patient, which is then the first official confirmation of exactly what it was. Then outside of China, the first laboratory confirmed case of COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 infection was reported by Thailand on January 13th, 2020. And then on February 11th of 2020, the International Committee of Taxonomy of Viruses named this novel coronavirus as that SARS, so it's SARS hyphen capital C, lowercase o, capital V, hyphen 2, so SARS-CoV-2. And then the WHO, the World Health Organization, named the disease COVID-19. Naming the disease and the virus that caused it simultaneously. And according to the 11th situation report of the World Health Organization on the novel coronavirus, by the end of January 2020, the SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 spread to 19 countries outside mainland China, with nearly 10,000 confirmed cases reported even by that early stage. And then on the recommendations of the Emergency Committee on 30th of January 2020, the World Health Organization declared the outbreak to be a public health emergency of international concern. Considering the global threat due to the widespread COVID infections in now more than 100 countries by early March, on the 11th of March, the WHO declared COVID as a pandemic. And we're going to come back to discussing also about the WHO's role in the response right at the end of the lecture as well. Now, as of the end of 2021, in that kind of arbitrary bracket of time that I've cut out from 2020 to 2022, where we might maybe consider it as the formal unrolling of the pandemic at that particular time. Sorry, getting another pop out from my RMIT account. Again, hope that's not infringing on the actual video, but in this little arbitrary time slot that I've carved out, until the end of 2021, the United States or North America had reported the highest number of confirmed cases, which is followed by Europe and then Asia. And in terms of the total of COVID-19 cases and the number of deaths at that particular time, the USA topped the list, followed by India, Brazil, and then Russia. And during this time as well, it's now changed slightly, but in this global pandemic, there was maybe, we might be able to identify 5 major mutated strains that emerged. Which were named Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta, and Omicron. I think there's now a few different ones as well, but by the end of 2021, that was kind of what we were looking at. In July 2020, there was a discovery of what was called a spike protein mutation in the COVID pathogen itself, which then allowed this little mutation then allowed the virus basically to trick immune systems based on the virus had already obviously been transmitting for a number of months by that time, and it had developed this mutation to avoid immune detection, and then that subsequent mutation then helped it really spread across the world. That's when we saw the real huge uptake, and this was called the alpha strain. And this was really pronounced throughout the world. And then again, there was another mutation which caused the beta strain, discovered in December 2020 in South Africa. The gamma variant was discovered in January 2021 in Brazil. Delta variant in the United Kingdom in March 21, and then the Omicron variant in November 2021 in Botswana. Then by mid-July 2022, it kind of, again, the end of our so-called formal period of this COVID crisis, 551 million cases had been confirmed in more than 194 countries with more than 6 million fatalities. So it is, obviously a very, very significant crisis. Like I briefly mentioned, there's still a lot of debates exactly, where did the virus emerge from? How can we understand the mortality and morbidity generating from the virus itself? But regardless, it still must be seen as a really significant bioepidemiological event. And as I'll argue and demonstrate soon, there's also an incredibly significant political economy event on the same level, almost, we'd say, probably, as the global financial crisis, a really life-defining event that we've all lived through. So now let's look at the causes of COVID-19. So this is now departing from the bioepidemiological background we just provided, and now going more into, well, what's the political economy antecedents or causes of how this crisis actually developed. So we can, and what I'm going to do actually, rather than just attempt, I guess, but we can attempt to distill the complex multifactorial antecedents of the crisis into 4 vectors, which I've placed together. And they're kind of catalyzed by the ongoing crises in neoliberalism that we have reviewed over the last few weeks, as neoliberalism has continued to lurch and stumble forward since the global financial crisis. And these 4 vectors outlines the 4 main ways, arguably, through which neoliberalism has co-generated the pandemic. First, through political ecological changes that have been wrought by a regime of financialized and market state enabled extractivism, and particularly on the market frontiers of many global South countries, and including, of course, on the frontier of China's fast developing global cities. Second, due to the vulnerabilities created by the transformations of ever more unequal and unstable neoliberalized societies globally. Third, through the weaknesses of health systems and health services, which have been scarred by decades of austerity and market discipline. And fourth, by the ways that quasi-constitutional neoliberal norms and rules also undermine global health security, leading, among other outcomes, to massive inequalities and inadequacies in the delivery of universal vaccination, which totally and utterly failed. And we're going to survey each of these vectors of health vulnerability, and in the terms of the first one, neoliberal neocoloniality, 2, neoliberal inequality, 3, neoliberal austerity, and 4, neoliberal legality. So this is what we're going to be focusing on now. This is the main kind of chunk of our lecture, to understand the political economy causes of the crisis. Now, one of the predominantly hypothesized causes of COVID-19, as it came from a zoonotic transmission, so zoonotic referring to transmission from animal, for example, connects strongly with the issues of climate change and global warming, which we will be discussing in, I think it's week 11 after we come back from the break. So it really connects very, very closely with those ideas, and some of the arguments I'll be presenting here will be ones that we'll come back to as well, and which we'll work on more deeply. And it's probably maybe a little bit of a shame that we didn't deal with climate change before this, because the ongoing process of climate change so far has given us has taken us to this point, as I'll mention now, and we haven't really touched on it yet. But when we do, hopefully, we'll try to synthesize these two areas together effectively as well. So, just like the other coronavirus, not quite pandemics, but the other viruses emergence, like we mentioned, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome and also SARS, they all grew out of wildlife refugia, and then in a matter of weeks spread to humans. And then obviously COVID-19 was a really shocking development of coronavirus, going from a arguably wildlife refuge, and then in a matter of just 8 weeks spreading to basically all of humanity. The virus emerged at one terminal point of a regional supply line in exotic foods, which then successfully set off a human-to-human chain of infections, then at the other end in Wuhan, China. And from there, the outbreak both diffused locally and then hopped onto planes and trains and spread out across the globe through a web structured by travel connections and down a hierarchy from smaller to larger to smaller cities. And then, other than describing the wild food market, for example, in Wuhan in a typical Orientalist fashion, little effort has really been expended, enough effort really has been expended on the more obvious questions that are at the background here, which is, how did the exotic food sector arrive at a point where it could sell its wares alongside more traditional livestock in the largest market in Wuhan? The animals here were not being sold off the back of a truck or in an alleyway. There would have been huge numbers of permits, payments involved in actually making this happen, and approvals as well. And well beyond fisheries, worldwide wild food is an increasingly formalized sector, not just in China, but elsewhere, ever more capitalized by the same sources that back huge agro-industrial production. Although it's not quite near the same level of output in the wild food sector, which is like, exotic, new and unusual foods, it's nowhere near the same kind of extent and breadth of the industrial agricultural sector, which we will be talking more on in our climate change week. But it's still a very opaque sector. And there's an overlapping economic geography there that extends back from these wet food markets to the hinterlands, where exotic and traditional foods are both raised and created by operations that border on the edges of contracting wilderness. Industrial production continues to encroach on the last remains of forest and other native areas throughout the world, and wild food operations must then cut further in to raise their delicacies or raid the last strands of particular wild food specimens that consumers desire or have been constructed to desire. And as a result, the most exotic of pathogens, and for instance, in our case of COVID-19, the bat-hosted SARS-2, find their way onto a truck, whether in food animals or the labor tending them, and then they're shotgunned from one end of a lengthening peri-urban circuit to the other before hitting the world stage. So this idea of expanding industrial production may arguably be pushing increasingly capitalized wild foods deeper into the last remaining of primary landscapes, which dredge out a wider unknown variety of potentially proto-pandemic pathogens. And peri-urban loops, and this means like the outskirts of urban areas, they're of a growing extent, right? The cities and urban areas are growing into rural what were previously rural areas, this increasing population density. Both of these things help increase the interface and spillover between what were previously known as wild non-human populations into newly urbanized rurality in a lot of countries around the world. And worldwide, even the wildest subsistence species are being roped into agricultural value chains, especially through the wild foods markets like ostriches, porcupines, crocodiles, even in Australia, fruit bats and palm civets, whose partially digested berries now supply the world's most expensive coffee bean. Some wild species are making it onto forks in this industry before they're even scientifically identified, including one new snot, I think it was a short-nosed dogfish, which was found in a Taiwanese market relatively recently. All are increasingly treated as food commodities in this wild food sector. And as nature is stripped place by place, species by species, what's left over becomes that much more valuable. So while the distinction between our classical big factory farms and wet markets isn't unimportant, we might miss their similarities and also intertwined relationships. And the distinction between big agricultural traditional factory farms and wet markets also are very intertwined by many other mechanisms, because many smallholder farms worldwide, including in China, is actually, a contractor for many corporate agricultural and wild food sectors. They grow out, day-old poultry, for instance, for industrial processing. So on a contracted small holding farm along the edge of a forest, a food animal, for instance, like a poultry, might catch a pathogen from the wilderness, which is very, very close to it now, before then being shipped back to a processing plant in the outer ring of a major city. And spreading factory farms, meanwhile, may force increasingly corporatized wild food companies to trawl deeper into the forest, as I mentioned before, increasing the likelihood of picking up a new pathogen while reducing the kind of environmental complexity with which the forest typically disrupts transmission chains. And as a class as well, coronaviruses appear to do really well in these distinctions between the growing urban, the shortening or the contracting rural, as well as the distinctions between the agro holdings and the wet foods purveyors. So coronaviruses straddle these quite well, because SARS-1 and SARS-2 appeared to have emerged out of wet markets. And whereas MERS, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, the other deadly coronavirus, emerged straight out of an industrializing camel sector in the Middle East. And then despite a general shift in population from rural areas to urban slums that continues today across the globe, the rural-urban divide that drives much of discussion around disease emergence misses rural destined labor and the rapid growth of rural towns into peri-urban city villages, which are kind of like in between cities. And these are really newly urbanizing landscapes in a lot of countries that act as both local markets and regional hubs for global agricultural commodities that pass through them. And as a result, the forest disease dynamics, which are pathogens kind of primal sources, are no longer constrained to a far off hinterland that wouldn't have had a lot of contact with humans previously. The epidemiological development of a lot of pathogens now have turned themselves highly relational to us, felt across both how quickly they get into human populations and how close we are geographically to them now. So a SARS coronavirus, for example, can suddenly find itself spilling over into humans in the big city a short time out of its bat cave. Ecosystems in which such wild viruses were in part controlled by the complexities of the tropical forest and the broader complexity of the ecosystem there are being drastically streamlined by capital-led deforestation, and then at the other end of peri-urban development by deficits in public health and environmental sanitation. And so while many pathogens uh, die off with the host species, there's a subset of infections that would once burn out relatively quickly in the forest, if only by, or through a very irregular rate of encountering their typical host species. But now these are propagating across susceptible human populations whose vulnerability to infection in cities is often exacerbated by, austerity programs and deregulation, which we'll touch on very soon. And even in the face of efficacious vaccines, the resulting outbreaks are characterized by greater extent, duration, and momentum. So what were once very local spillovers are now epidemics trawling their way through global webs of travel and trade. And so such standards or previous standards such as Ebola, Zika, malaria, yellow fever, which have really evolved comparatively little, have all turned into major regional threats through this mechanism. They've suddenly moved from spilling over into remote villages every now and again to then infecting thousands in capital cities. And then in something of the other kind of ecological direction, even wild animals who are routinely long-time disease reservoirs are suffering blowbacks. Their populations are fragmented by deforestation. So, for instance, like native New World monkeys, which are susceptible to wild-type yellow fever, to which they had been exposed for at least 100 years, are now losing their herd immunity and dying in the hundreds of thousands. And this is kind of what arguably links a remote bat cave in hinterland China with the morgues of New York, London, and Sydney. Big farms, like these huge agricultural corporations, and the wild foods that's now commonly associated with them batters down natural ecologies, destroy diversities, and breaks the previous interlinkages between these areas. Viruses that would have burnt themselves out in the forest for a lack of carriers now adapt to a new ecology of monocultures, animal factories, and slum cities. They mutate and evolve and then achieve fast-track transmission through mass concentrations of the same species, such as humans. And this global supply chains of giant agricultural transnationals that operate in dozens of countries and markets in 1,000 cities around the world then do the rest to aid the movement of the virus. And then once a new variant is established in these new and unusual conditions for these viruses, it replicates by the trillion hyperspeed, throwing up chance mutations, testing new waves of spreading, as we saw in COVID-19 when I touched on a few different mutations that have already been seen quite early on. The disease then becomes endemic and chronic, embedded in human society, and continues to evolve, waging a relentless life or death struggle against lockdowns and vaccines by constant shape-shifting in its efforts to breach the defenses. And we've seen this with COVID today as well. It's now totally embedded in our human population, and it continues to mutate. And so if by its global expansion alone, commodity-based agriculture serves as both a propulsion for and a nexus through which pathogens of diverse origins can migrate from the most remote reservoirs to the most international of population centers. And it's here and along the way where novel pathogens infiltrate agriculture's gated communities. The lengthier the associated supply chains and the greater the extent of deforestation, the more diverse and exotic the zoonotic pathogens that could enter the food chain. Among recent emergent and re-emergent farm and foodborne pathogens, which have originated from across the anthropogenic domain, are African swine fever, Campylobacter, Cryptosporium, Cyclosporium, Ebola reston, E. coli 0157, H7, foot and mouth disease, hepatitis E, Listeria, Nipah virus, Q fever, Salmonella, Vibrio, Yersinia, and a variety of novel influenza variants like H1N1 in 2009, H1N2V, H3N2V, H5N1, H5N2, H5NX, H6N1, H7N1, H7N3, H7N7, H7N9, and H9N2. There's a huge number of these new viruses that are popping up around the world. So, however unintended, the entirety of the production line is organized around practices that accelerate the evolution of pathogenic virulence and subsequent transmission, growing genetic monocultures, food animals and plants with nearly identical genomes, removes like the ability for these species to have immune like fire breaks that in more diverse populations slow down transmission. And so pathogens now can just quickly evolve around the commonplace host immune genotypes. And then crowded conditions then depress an immune response. And so when you see these, gigantic industrial farms with, millions or maybe hundreds of thousands of chickens, which all have the exact same genotype in incredibly crowded conditions, all pumped full of antibiotics, these chickens don't stand a chance to adapt any kind of immune response to a new virus or bacteria. And same as well, particularly with plants too. And as we'll talk about in our climate change week, most large agricultural holdings have monocultures of one particular crop with one DNA strand, which is exactly the same for hectares on end. So these larger farm animal population sizes and factory farm densities facilitate greater transmission and recurrent infection. This high throughput, which is a part of any kind of industrial production, provides a continually renewed supply of susceptible organisms at barn, farm, and regional levels, removing the cap on the evolution of pathogen deadliness. Housing a lot of animals together rewards those strains that can burn through them the best. And decreasing the age of slaughter that we see in a lot of industrial farms, like to 6 weeks in chicken, is also likely to select for pathogens that are able to survive more robust immune system and travel quicker. So lengthening the geographic extent of live animal trade and export has increased the diversity of genomic segments that their associated pathogens exchange with, increasing the rate at which disease agents explore their evolutionary possibilities. So we've got to keep in mind when we're thinking about, the viruses developing, that it is not something that's just come out of chance. Like we're now in an era where we're constantly having new pathogens come out of seemingly nowhere, and arguably a lot of this is because of our agricultural practices, which have been changing in like an enormous scale, really enormous scale since especially the 1970s. And we'll try to touch on this when we talk about our climate change week. Now, talking about the vector of neoliberal inequality, once the virus left China, its globalizing spread was widely enabled by market forces in global societies, long restructured by neoliberal norms and policies. At the outset of the virus spread, this most obviously took the form of the global free market in airline travel, the globalized movements of business travelers and tourists who quickly became super spreaders of the virus around the world. But far more impactful in terms of spreading morbidity and mortality from COVID on the ground were the diverse forms of social inequality and vulnerability that had been induced around the world by this pro-market policy making and the associated neoliberalization of societies that we have been touching on the last few weeks. The component causal connections of this vector, linking the inequalities and vulnerabilities generated by neoliberalism with poor health outcomes, were already very well documented in literatures on the social determinants of health that pre-existed the pandemic. So it was very obvious to everyone before the pandemic hit that these neoliberal circuits were already causing health concerns. And so as the virus was raging through the global population, the World Health Organization and Commission on the Social Determinants of Health said that inequalities are killing people on a grand scale. The commissioners here did not ascribe the associated causal connections explicitly to neoliberalism by name, but they did highlight how the structural drivers of bad policy, economics, and politics had gone global with globalization. These structural drivers, they concluded in their report, operate within countries under the authority of governments, but also increasingly over the last century and a half between countries under the effects of globalization. The toxic combination of bad policies, and I'm still quoting here, economics and politics is in large measure responsible for the fact that a majority of the people in the world do not enjoy the health that is biologically possible. So direct or indirect, the causal connections between neoliberalism-induced social vulnerabilities and ill health were then newly exposed and exploited by COVID in devastating ways. And this meant that while the pandemic globalized fast, it did not create a flat world with equal primary health outcomes everywhere. Instead, COVID ripped through the fault lines that had been created by neoliberalism throughout societies, bringing illness and death disproportionately to communities already deprived and dispossessed by market forces previously. So for the same reasons, the same underlying neoliberal causes of vulnerability tracked by public health scholars pre-COVID became hotspots of the pandemic as well. The exposure of essential workers to heightened risks of infection, whether in the informal labor markets of poor countries or the so-called gig economies and the post-Fordist precariats of rich countries, created one such conduit of increased vulnerability. Class and conditions of work had been forgotten by a lot of scholars, but the pandemic provided a brutal reminder of their basic centrality to the human condition. And another source of vulnerability was created by all the legacy effects of welfare reform and cutbacks to social protections previously undertaken in the pursuit of neoliberal tax cuts and austerity, deregulation, and privatization. The widespread inequalities, social alienation, and biopolitical abandonment that's associated with these neoliberal policies showed up repeatedly in such COVID petri dish spaces as homeless camps, slums, prisons, and overcrowded farm work housing. And overshadowing most of these sites of vulnerability have clearly also been the other co-acting, co-pathogenic causes of vulnerability as well, including not least of all, racism, xenophobia, and caste hierarchies. And these racializing causal components of co-pathogenesis widely worked as such damaging vectors of disease because of the neoliberal structuring of highly stratified labor markets in which people of color, migrants, and lower castes tend to be overrepresented in the most acutely exposed ranks of essential but contingent workers and informal labor markets, employed in cleaning, delivering, driving, meat packing, farming, retail, recycling, and the care work of social reproduction. Their inability to work from home during the pandemic came together with the contingency of their contracts as part of the flexible and wageless workforces of neoliberalism to exacerbate their exposure to the virus. Unsalaried, ununionized, and unsupported by pension and workplace health benefits, they were also constantly menaced by the threat of unemployment and underemployment. And because of other embodied risks due to other diseases closely associated with living in communities subject to racist policing, incarceration, pollution, and social exclusion, they suffered and died from COVID at much higher rates than more economically privileged populations. So it wasn't just the fact, as we reviewed earlier on with our bioepidemiological review, that it just so happened that people of color from Black, Asian backgrounds just happen to die more frequently. There was very much, these political economy factors that led to this. Now let's then speak on the vector of neoliberal austerity. And this is a very closely related vector of this pandemic co-pathogenesis that was exploited by COVID and consisted of all the openings for disease created by the direct impact of neoliberal austerity and market discipline on health systems and health services. Before COVID, the health impacts of this vector were perhaps a very widely studied aspect of how neoliberalization impacted global and public health. Some researchers tracked the damaging impact of neoliberal structural adjustment programs on poor country health systems, which were, for lack of a better word, quite disastrous. Others highlighted what some had described as the neoliberal epidemics of cost-cutting and pro-market reforms that undermined health services in rich countries. And globally, researchers also regularly recorded the embodied ill health outcomes tied to austerity-enforced cutbacks and rationing, as well as the advance of privatization, the imposition of user fees, and a relentless focus on personal responsibilization as the market-based alternatives to government support services. So not surprisingly, given the global reach of these, but for lack of a better word, political economic pathology, COVID then exposed and exploited the openings afforded by austerity and market discipline everywhere it went. This pandemic co-pathogenesis and directly exploited the legacy effects of neoliberal austerity and market discipline in countries with hollowed out institutional and bureaucratic capacities. Most of these countries and their healthcare systems were dependent on contracting out to provide services to the private sector. And so these countries found themselves totally ill-equipped to exercise effective command and control of fragmented national systems in response to a huge pandemic. And instead, they continued to outsource and subcontract as a means of plugging gaps in national pandemic response capacities. And these neoliberal norms then led to many other problems in test and trace systems and the supply of personal protective equipment. Many low and middle income countries came into the pandemic dependent on the private sector for up to 80% of all hospital care capacities, often leaving a thin regulatory state weakly managing poorly assimilated private health providers. This then left them with downgraded public systems of primary and tertiary care, dependent upon parallel programs of marketized health provisions and private hospital services that could not function in the pandemic because of the huge declines in revenues from elective procedures. The pandemic rapidly multiplied financial damage to private providers and particularly hospitals, with rising concerns over mass insolvency in many different national contexts. And the mixture of lockdown measures combined with the for-profit configuration of these privatized hospital services and capacities led to huge drop-offs in demand for services. And in response, the pandemic saw a surge in COVID-related price gouging by private hospitals as a result of this search for an opportunity for profit, or from their own COVID-induced financial precarity, charging high rates for admission and treatment of COVID patients and for associated costs of inpatient testing and personal protective equipment in many lower and middle income countries. So these austerity programs, which again, we mentioned earlier in the course, how the World Bank and the IMF and other Western-backed financiers had pressured developing countries to privatize and marketize their public health services, amongst other public services, because the idea was that, well, the private sector can do it more efficiently, it'll reduce the burden of the state. And so the impact of this has been that most developing countries have been totally incapacitated and unable to deal with public health emergencies. Now, importantly, let's go, well, it's all been important, but let's go to our fourth vector here, the vector of neoliberal legality. And this has an important link to the idea of neoliberalism that I've been trying to emphasize so far during this course, which we'll touch on in a moment. So while the deregulatory effects of market provision created a crisis of care in our privatized health systems and care facilities during the pandemic, another vector of vulnerability exploited by COVID featured what maybe we might call a re-regulatory effect of neoliberal policymaking, or what I'll refer here just as neoliberal legality. And as the intellectual historians, Quinn Slobodian, who I've highly recommended his books, his book Globalist for you to read. He's also got a fantastic more recent book called Crack Up Capitalism, which is also a really brilliant read to understand neoliberalism, as well as the intellectual historian Jessica White, whose book Morals of the Market is also a fantastic exploration into the intellectual development of human rights around neoliberalism. Both of these scholars have shown that it was always an important goal of neoliberalism itself, as well as neoliberal thinkers, to encase the economy and protect it from any kind of disruptions. And this is something I've emphasized again and again so far in this course, that neoliberalism is not about the rhetorical free markets that it's always presented as. As you'll hear in the government, you'll hear in the media, you'll hear from neoliberal theorists themselves, but it's more predominantly about ensuring that the market is protected. And we see this again and again and again through crises and through other evolutions throughout the Washington Consensus, throughout the post-Washington Consensus, and we'll see it in the Wall Street Consensus in our final week. So it's always been an important goal to encase the economy and defend the so-called morals of the market through transnational legal agreements that grant corporations quasi-constitutional rights and enduring protections from both democratic discontent and national state exceptions. And historically, this has started with the Bretton Woods-based push towards free trade internationally in the 1940s, the 50s, and the 60s that was augmented by the growing hegemony of the Washington Consensus, that form of neoliberalism in the 1980s. And these plans were then increasingly turned into a transnational neoliberal legal reality in trade deals from the 1990s onwards, which led to what we also mentioned before, this idea of this new constitutionalism, which is theorized by the political science Stephen Gill, where Gill argued that there was a whole suite of transnational agreements, including those made by the signatory members of the World Trade Organization, the North America Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, and the EU, which effectively served to entrench and expand neoliberal legality, and thereby granted corporations these quasi-constitutional protections from the perturbations of democratic discontent and anti-neoliberal policy plans. So effectively, by governments joining into these transnational multilateral agreements, they locked these countries forever into the requirements of these deals, which gave companies protections and basically protected them and their ability to make profit. So these companies could take countries to court in international forums if countries did any policies that impacted their profit making, for example. And this new constitutionalism, if we remember, was a really constituent part of the post-Washington Consensus. Because remember, the Washington Consensus was about the structural adjustment, the free trade, which broke the back of labor to protect the neoliberal economy, whereas the post-Washington Consensus, which was spurred by the good governance agenda by the World Bank, promoted the institutionalization of neoliberalism, where there was that focus to create the institutional structures that would ensure the longevity of a neoliberal market economy. One of the main ways was through this new constitutionalism, which locked countries into market reforms and a market economy in perpetuity through these international multilateral agreements. And health scholars and some that have actually collaborated in their research with Stephen Gill, whose works I also highly recommend having a look at from the late 90s, that they have shown how consequential the neoliberal kind of legal discipline of this new constitutionalism has been in undermining health rights specifically, which again, it straitjackets the capacity of legislatures and government agencies to respond to health crises and make progress towards health for all globally. Some have highlighted in this way how neoliberal trade rules limit the capacity of governments to regulate unhealthy foods, for example, and other internationally traded commodities, creating increasingly lower ceilings on standards while undermining democratic policymaking aimed at establishing better protections. And then others have also shown how trade law intellectual property protections for pharmaceutical firms represent a regime of such successful market constitutionalization that has subsequently prompted a charitable counter regime designed to correct the successful market failure in providing affordable drugs for the world poor. And then others have pointed to the wider charitable response to problems created by a neoliberalism, which has formed this new kind of charitable consensus, which is epitomized by, for example, the Gates Foundation, which is based in Washington, that effectively reinforces the neoliberal legality of the new constitutionalism with compensatory philanthro-capitalistic investments and memorandums of understanding with corporations designed to enforce access-based pricing, while still respecting monopolies that are enshrined in intellectual property laws. We will, however, fully discuss this new form of capitalism that is with us today in our last week, because this isn't quite the full story. But I also want to put out a challenge to our law students who are in our class, and to get them to start thinking critically of the multilateral agreements and the intellectual property agreements that many of our legal courses take as standard and as non-controversially, and think about how the political economy of these and how it affects the ability for democracies and for people to choose their policies going forward. And I'll certainly be harassing my law students about that in tutorials coming up. Now, COVID exposed the vector of neoliberal legality because of how its viral evolution and expansion exploited weaknesses in global response planning created by these quasi-constitutional market rules, norms, and commitments to free trade. Pandemic co-pathogenesis was aided and abetted in this way by many global health insecurities arising from the elevation of corporate rights over health rights. And this happened most obviously in the corporate-dominated pharmaceutical sector, where the protection of the intellectual property rights held by leading vaccine makers systematically undermined efforts to extend universal vaccination against COVID to everybody on the planet. To be sure, there was other forces, including geopolitical interests driving vaccine nationalism that also contributed co-pathogenically to the resulting inequalities in vaccination access around the world. But the main problem was created by the ways that entrenched systems of neoliberal legality systematically preempted compulsory licensing and other non-neoliberal strategies for overriding or curtailing intellectual property patent rights in order to expand affordable vaccine access globally. And this happened both through the initial period of vaccine development and delivery, which was entirely through government-funded schemes, such as so-called Operation Warp Speed in the US, and then subsequently through the attempts led by COVAX in Geneva to coordinate a response to global access inequalities based on public-private philanthropic partnership arrangements, semi-charitable and quasi-constitutionalist arrangements that themselves encode neoliberal legality insofar as they are designed to save lives and pharmaceutical intellectual property rights at the same time. So bound by the quasi-constitutional protection for intellectual property rights locked into international trade agreements and institutions, the pricing of the vaccines by these innovative firms, which was totally subsidized by the government, and the close associations between these firms and the governments themselves that represents their core markets, they created paywalls and other exclusions for populations living in countries that couldn't afford or negotiate high-cost pre-purchase agreements. But going beyond all the vaccine nationalism and the queue jumping by rich countries, what ultimately came to block affordable access in the global south was the wealthy world's commitments to the World Trade Organization's agreements on protecting intellectual property rights globally through the neoliberal legality encoded in its trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, or TRIPS. In October 2020, for example, the Indian and South African governments attempted to obtain a waiver at the World Trade Organization from this TRIPS, this the protection of intellectual property rights in trade, so that they might use compulsory licenses to enable production of COVID-related medical technologies. And they also sought to overcome the neoliberal legality limits that had developed through preceding rounds of World Trade Organization rulemaking on the ability of countries to activate the so-called Doha Declaration and override these TRIPS enforced patents in the context of a global health emergency. Now, in response, all OECD, all the wealthy countries presented uniformly rejected the proposal on October 15th, 2020, and continued to oppose subsequent attempts to pursue a waiver in the World Trade Organization. In Geneva, even the World Health Organization added its own institutional support for this waiver of intellectual property rights around the vaccines, along other efforts to create a COVID-19 technology access pool through which IP, the intellectual property for vaccines and COVID therapies, could be shared on a more global multilateral basis. But as debate over the waiver went on at the World Trade Organization itself, it became clear that negotiators representing the home countries of the big intellectual property owning pharmaceutical firms were not going to capitulate. And it was not until March 2022 that a compromise settlement started to emerge at the World Trade Organization in Geneva, 2 full years after the emergence of the pandemic and after its most severe form. And even then, it was so enclosed by new intellectual property protections and restrictions on what countries could actually use the waiver and under what new kinds of conditionality they could use it, with even like compliance with new rules that barred crucial kinds of data sharing, that it left the vision of a universally and affordably accessible people's vaccine for COVID as far off as ever. And in the critical assessment of former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, the compromise waiver was weakened so much that it was barely a waiver at all. And so it's against this ongoing failure to improve access through a real waiver of TRIPS rules that the efforts to coordinate a public-private philanthropic alternative through COVAX then took shape in Geneva. Now, founded in 2020 at the start of the COVID pandemic, COVAX was supposed to, and quoting here, accelerate the development, production, and equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines globally. However, over time, it too has repeatedly failed to honor its promises and deliver even a reliable, let alone equitable supply. Some of the reasons used to explain these failures are externalizing in character, focusing on how early COVAX visions of guaranteeing universal global access to vaccines through a global sharing and coordination mechanism, as you may have remembered from the early stages of the pandemic, kind of floundered on the rocks of a vaccine nationalism. Other explanations were more internalizing, which highlighted the institutional involutions of COVAX itself from what was first imagined as a risk pooling and dose sharing multilateral buyers club into a risk managing, dose rationing, donor dependent agency that was institutionally embedded in ever more complex, non-transparent and oligarchical partnerships of global health governance. But linking these external and internal explanations together for the failures of COVAX, we also see it as being tied to this vector of neoliberal legality. In short, it was never going to be able to deliver on the promise of universal vaccination because its legalistic scheme for addressing vaccine apartheid and saving some lives selectively with compensatory vaccine deliveries were legally tied from the start to saving vaccine intellectual property from more radical proposals for compulsory licensing, TRIPS waivers, and a universal people's vaccine, as we noted. So for these same reasons, what was kind of most pernicious about the COVAX scheme is that rich countries and their pharmaceutical companies basically repeatedly used it as a shield to deflect demands for intellectual property waivers. So I won't get onto intellectual property too much, but yet again, I want to challenge anyone who's studying law as well. And when you're looking at intellectual property, look at it very, very critically, because it's normally seen as something that will just, helps protect creativity and the emergence of new technologies. But the monopolizing of intellectual property is something that is basically keeping the the products of most intellectual labor around the world, which is usually publicly funded from most people around the world. A really fantastic book on this is called First the Seed, on intellectual property. And there's many more on this, but intellectual property has not only been a huge issue in like vaccine and public health, but also in agriculture and the monopolization of seeds, of plant DNA, and all kinds of manners of agriculture, which is now owned by very, very few companies around the world. So I won't get too much into that because that will be another 2 hours. So let's continue now finally to our response to COVID. And we're going to deal with this much, much more briefly because I think the major focus that we want to have here as the antecedents to COVID-19, and many of your other arts classes also deal with the public policy responses to COVID. But I'll just trace some broad outlines, and we'll address this response more in tutorials this week, hopefully in a fun and exciting way. Now, most Western countries did struggle to develop and sustain effective policies for dealing with the pandemic, despite the fact that they scored the highest rankings in the 2019 Global Health Security Index. They tended to alternate between periods in which they followed the advice of scientific communities and then periods during which economic concerns prevailed and ruled out the imposition of vigorous approaches. Now, at the same time, scientific communities themselves were often frequently divided and politicized. And this was especially the case in the United Kingdom and the United States, both of which suffered disproportionately severe human economic consequences from the pandemic by comparison to most other high-income countries. And the COVID-19 pandemic unleashed a massive global economic crisis that would become even more exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. And the war in Ukraine, amongst other global conflicts, will be something we deal with in week 10. And as a result of death and lockdown, global labor markets imploded. And led by the United States, governments then responded with fiscal efforts, which reached already to $8 trillion by April 2020 and 14 trillion by January 2021. And the twos reading this week goes into that in some detail, which I'd really recommend having a look at. But this was led by the US Federal Reserve, and central banks pumped trillions of dollars into the financial system, which then triggered massive asset speculation, which resulted in seemingly intractable 40-year high inflation rates that then threatened to push the world in deflation with massive negative consequences for developing countries. And the inflation that we're experiencing today is still premised on this huge pumping of trillions of dollars into the financial system, which then had fueled this asset-based speculation, which has not gone away from us after the global financial crisis, which, if anything, has gotten worse. And so the inflation we're experiencing today, nothing to do with wages or anything else that the media might say, but totally dependent on this huge pumping of trillions of dollars into the pockets of the richest corporations and people around the world for asset speculation. And all the economic effects of the pandemic exposed all of these problems and contradictions in the world economy that has not fully recovered from the global financial crisis of 2007 to 2009 that we've been discussing in our last previous weeks, as well as all the problems from the post GFC stagflationary austerity period as well. Now, before we end, I just want to touch on the World Health Organization because they played a central role here, and they play a central role, or at least should do, in guiding international policies on health. But, as many places have argued, it'd be erroneous to perceive it as a neutral scientific organization. And typically this focuses on the role of major donor countries in the World Health Organization, such as the United States, which obviously pulled out funding, and then focused very much on China and the political controversies of the World Health Organization in delaying calling COVID a pandemic because of the imputed concerns of Chinese funding, but also equally, it's governed by the World Health Assembly, and this comprises representatives from not only its member states, but it's increasingly funded by philanthropic capitalists such as Bill and Melinda Gates and their eponymous foundation. And there's been some really wonderful scholarship on this area which has demonstrated shifts, complicated shifts that have evolved throughout the World Health Organization's history, which has been influenced by the increasing movement of philanthrocapitalists into the funding of the World Health Organization and in influencing it in an advisory capacity as well. And one particular piece that I looked at for the research for this lecture analyzed the shifts that had taken place in the role of the World Health Organization with reference to the 2007 really important World Health Report, which was called A Safer Future, Global Public Health Security in the 21st Century. The authors of this piece traced the World Health Organization's policy turn in the wake of the World Bank's early 1990s prescriptions to reduce publicly provided healthcare to a basic minimum package of services. So remember, we spoke about previously the World Bank, especially, but also the IMF, have been really heavily involved in reducing public funding to a range of services, one of them being health. In the early 1990s, the World Bank had a big call to developing countries to reduce their healthcare to the very basic minimum. And at this time, this also led the World Health Organization to shift away from the 1978 so-called ideologically motivated declaration that promised health for all. And this has then encouraged the World Health Organization to slowly move towards neoliberal dictates after that 1990s early World Bank report. And then it has since then been more involved in focusing on health surveillance and biosecurity. And this is particularly because it started to reflect concerns of the international community that followed the September 2001 attacks, the SARS pandemic, our first coronavirus pandemic, and also the 2004 tsunami disaster. And the first SARS pandemic actually brought to the fore an additional concern, which regarded the inadequacy of secondary and tertiary healthcare services to deal with these kind of emergencies, and noted that these services were at that particular time in the early 2000s largely privately funded as a consequence of cuts in public sector funding and privatization as part of this agenda of neoliberalization, which really hasn't changed and just has gotten worse since that particular time. And the COVID pandemic has been particularly emblematic of these concerns. So the one justification for the suppression strategy of the lockdown was biosecurity concerns, and the other justification was the need to flatten the curve to prevent overwhelming tertiary health facilities which are not accessible to large sections of the population. So these two concerns, which were with us from the international community, especially on the World Health Organization since the early 2000s, of biosecurity and a lack of tertiary health facilities, had been exactly the same concerns as in 2020. So the World Health Organization has been at the forefront of maintaining those quite limited perspectives into healthcare. And in countries where private healthcare is the norm or provides the bulk of healthcare, the COVID-19 pandemic offered an opportunity to bring the private sector under state control or under some kind of collective control to provide equitable access to healthcare and control measures. But tragically, there was absolutely no takers in that. And the World Health Organization could have also obviously played a role in calling for something like this, but it didn't. And because of the increased integration, firstly, of neoliberal doctrine in healthcare systems around the world, which the World Health Organization had been the forefront of since the early 1990s, and the increased engagement of philanthro-capitalist individuals and foundations into the World Health Organization's work, they're obviously very reticent to disparage any kind of privatization of healthcare. And in times of public health crisis, the private health system has rarely, if ever, coveted itself in glory. Even another paper that I read for this lecture demonstrated a plague outbreak in 1994 in Surat in India, in which 76% of private practitioners just fled the city in the wake of the outbreak. And then the remaining public healthcare workers, which are a tiny fraction of the total, were left to deal with infectious disease control and treatment and then faced incredibly high risk of contagion and death. And then during the Ebola pandemic, there was a really high mortality among health workers and public health workers, with Liberia, for instance, reporting an 8% reduction in healthcare personnel in the entire country due to the epidemic. And then in the case of COVID-19, high rates of infection and death have been reported among different levels of healthcare workers. And the World Health Organization estimated that between January 2020 and May 2021, between 80 to 180,000 healthcare and care workers globally had died of COVID-19. And workers also suffered from burnout and mental health issues, including post-traumatic stress disorder. And by and large, mostly all public health workers, where the private health system either totally faded away from view, or there was some leasing out of their facilities to public workers, and they totally stepped back from the difficulties of running the response to COVID-19. And I'll also maybe have a chance to talk a little bit about this and the private healthcare setting in our tutorials this week from my own personal experience working as a doctor in the public health system, and how the private health system interacted with us, which will hopefully be maybe some interesting personal stories. Now, after all that, that is pretty much it for this week. What I just want to do first is say that I hope you're all looking forward to a very good mid-semester break, which is very muchly deserved, and that you get to relax somewhat. And then we'll come back after the break, deal with the final sector or the final part of our course, which will hopefully be a very exciting one, which looks at the very hot contemporary issues of global political economy, and then where we're going for the future. So stay tuned for that. Thank you very, very much for joining in so far, everyone, and please enjoy the tutorials this week, and we look forward to seeing you then. All right, thank you very much, everyone.